Greetings to everybody. Today we will have a very important guest together with us. Rodrigo Ramalho and Ramin Pro will be the moderators, and they will start our meeting.
Okay, I think we'll just begin by welcoming everyone who is tuning in, and to all the participants who are who have joined us, members of SEED. And yeah, so our topic of discussion for today will be developing a research project, and specifically we are trying to cater this as a guide for medical students. So perhaps without further ado, let's just jump right into it. And let us invite Professor David Barron to present his thoughts.
Okay, well, thank you, Ramin, and good morning to all of you. For anybody on the West Coast, thank you for staying up late. It's just after midnight here in Los Angeles. And as Dr. Ko knows, who's on the call, he was on the call with me at 7 a.m. this morning. So I'm beginning my day with Dr. Ko, and I have the great pleasure of ending my day on a Zoom call with Dr. Ko. And what makes it very special is I'm very honored and pleased to say that Dr. Ko has been one of my mentees and has gone on to great things. I'm sure he'll surpass anything I've ever done in my 40-plus year career. But I want to thank him for not only being such a wonderful mentee, what he's done, and a great way to start and end the day with my friend and colleague, along with all of you. So since it's very late in Los Angeles and mid-morning over there, I thought I would start this off, rather than some PowerPoint slides, which can tend to be a little boring. I want to start off with a story that I believe will really highlight what it is we want to talk about today. So some of you might have heard of Hans Selye. Hans Selye is considered the father of stress medicine. Hans was born in Prague, or I'm sorry, he was actually born in Hungary, and his family moved, and he went to medical school at the age of 17 at the German medical school in Prague. He was 17. He ended up graduating top in his class. He came from a family of physicians, so there was probably a lot of pressure. As a medical student, Selye observed that a lot of his patients who had very different diseases had a very common pathophysiologic response, regardless of what the illness was. He wrote about this as a medical student, why it's always good to share your findings in the press, and he won himself a very prestigious scholarship to Johns Hopkins University, where he went and studied for a year, expanding on this observation that he had made as a medical student, that patients with a variety of chronic diseases had very similar pathophysiologic responses. And what he hypothesized, observation hypothesis, was that there was something about having a chronic disease that led to this very similar pathophysiologic problem in a number of organs. It wasn't just one. So to keep the story short, he went on to study observation, hypothesis, collected data on why was it that all these various diseases that didn't seem to really have anything in common were presenting with this very, very similar physiologic response. He left after he did a year fellowship in Hopkins, went up to McGill University, where he actually finished his career in Montreal, Canada, continued his work. He was actually trained in endocrinology, did a lot of his work in hormones. And for those of you who have studied it, he is literally the father of stress medicine. We think of stress before him, and we talked about stress as a physicist might talk about, or the stress of gravity. Selye really single-handedly, and he's had many hundreds of publications, was the one that talked about the general adaptation syndrome, or the role of stress from a physiologic perspective. And he did everything from animal research to test his hypotheses, to human research, and clearly a brilliant man who brought in many different disciplines. And the reason I wanted to start with this was not only that starting a research project begins with an observation or an idea, but the story doesn't have a real happy ending, as far as I'm concerned, as an academic. Although Selye was brilliant and made significant contributions. In fact, the field that I studied early on in my career, psychoneuroimmunology, which is basically, some of you might read about that. I've written a reasonable amount about that. It's kind of the effect of stress and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis on mood and behavior and physical response. So the GAS, he talked about that. Interestingly, although he made the observation, had a hypothesis, conducted well-controlled trials, made observations, went back and researched all the things we're going to talk about today. Unfortunately, Selye was nominated 11 times for the Nobel Prize. That was the quality of his work and his observations and the impact it had on clinical medicine. It was really his work that got us to understand the role of stress and hormones. We're so used to it, it's hard to imagine not thinking, well, when you're stressed, cortisol, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal, activation of the POMC gene, the feedback effect of gonadotropins to gonadosteroids back to the brain. It's kind of at the heart of what we do in stress medicine. Selye never won the Nobel Prize. 11 times he was nominated. And the reason he didn't win it, and what I wanted to share with our young colleagues, the future of our field on this call today, was Selye took $50,000 a year for 3 years from the tobacco industry. Back in the 60s, when this work was going, this is when we had lots of good data demonstrating that smoking cigarettes was not at all good for your health. In fact, it was deadly and it was addictive. But what happened is Philip Morris and many of the large tobacco industries were making a lot of money, and they used their money to make sure that anything that came out to talk about, like cigarettes were bad for you, was squashed. So for $50,000 a year for 3 years, they got Hans Selye, who was, again, considered, and to this day, a giant in his field, a brilliant clinician, researcher. They got him to come out and kind of not so much lie, or he would have been, his career would have ended in disgrace. But what they got him to say is, well, stress is clearly associated with many diseases, and it's definitely associated with the shortening of one's lifespan. People were under chronic stress, which is kind of the core. If you might recall, the general adaptation syndrome was, so if you have a stress, an organism responds to that stress, and they're able to lower it. If they don't respond to the stress, and the stress continues, you have what he called distress, and ultimately death of the organism, or a failure of many physiologic symptoms. So one of three things happen. The body accommodates to stress, and then it's not stressful anymore. It's not distress. The stress goes away, or the stress doesn't go away, the body doesn't accommodate, and then we have this breakdown. And that was based on his observations as a medical student. What he came out and said was cigarettes help lower stress in people. And the tobacco industry took that to Washington and all their lobbyists, and they said, well, in fact, not only are cigarettes not bad for your health, but they might extend life. Because here's one of the world's eminent scientists saying that, in fact, cigarettes, and the reality is there is them. People would say, yes, when I smoke, it's stress reducing. And unfortunately, that's all the tobacco industry needed. And now it took probably 30, 35 years, and who knows how many deaths and morbidity and mortality worldwide before we've seen this change. And we still see significant smoking in many parts of the world. The one thing that when he was kind of pushed, as it were, by the medical establishment, and they'd say, well, do you really believe cigarettes are helpful and will increase longevity. And what he said is, I do believe that when some people smoke, it does help lower their stress. And then the reporters asked him, do you think it's health producing? He said, well, let me just answer that by saying, I don't smoke and I don't think I ever will. And I enjoy life. The problem was what got into the news and what you saw, if you were around in the 60s like I was, maybe one of the only ones, except Professor Boulan, who was, I think he's probably 5 or 6 years younger than I am, but I'm sure he'll but so why do I bring that story up? And it's to highlight a couple of very important things. The first thing is when you want to establish kind of a research agenda, it should start off with an idea, an observation, a passion you have for something. I remember, because I was a big fan of Celia, I didn't know till I read years later about this, about, observing something and then testing it. And I remember in my own, many of you might know a little bit about my background. I've worked in quite a few Olympic Games, and I remember working Olympic boxing, and the first games that I ever worked, which was 1984. I've worked many since then. And I remember working the boxing, and it had a significant effect on my career. I was already a little bit interested in concussion in sports because I had been an athlete myself. But what I observed when I was one of the events I covered was boxing. It was the first and last time I never covered boxing again. I said, I'll cover the sport I participated in, which was swimming and some other sports. But the one thing I observed was the boxers, when they got hit or stunned. And as the physician, I was not acting as a sports psychiatrist then. I was just they didn't have sports psychiatrists in the Olympics in '84. I was acting as a sports physician, was the look in their eyes. I couldn't really describe it, but it was this glassy look. Like they couldn't quite focus and their eyes moved a little slower. But I saw it consistently. And then I was working at the Olympic Training Center up in Colorado Springs, and then it used to be in Lake Placid when I first got there. And I saw the Olympic boxers who were training. And even they didn't get knocked out, and I would do the evaluation. I saw this same look in their eyes, this kind of glassy eye stare. I couldn't describe it, but it was absolutely consistent with what I had seen earlier. And long story short, learning from Celia, again, a research career, we always learn the people who came before us, unless you're really brilliant, and I wasn't. But I remembered reading about him, and we started looking. I started studying eye tracking with concussion. And you fast forward almost 30 years from that, and a team of engineers I was working with, we actually developed a very they've developed it. I just kind of went along for the ride and kind of helped them a bit, but an eye tracking device. And we were able to identify almost 30 years later, 5 eye signs that I observed as a sports physician, but observed it again and again and was able to then study it. So we know now that vergence, horizontal and vertical convergence, saccades, anti-saccades, and smooth eye pursuit, those 5 eye signs now are considered a very good biomarker amongst many others. Dr. Ko is an eminent sports psychiatrist now in Malaysia. He's worked in this area for many years, the premier sports psychiatrist in Malaysia. I'm happy to call him my friend and colleague on this. So a research project starts with not like, I want to do research, or I need to get it on my CV so I can get into a better residency program, or that I can get a better job. And I hear this from med students all the time. I get it. I understand it. It's very competitive to get into the top programs. Even the not so top programs has gotten very competitive. And certainly in our field in psychiatry. And a lot of people want to do research. And a lot of people call me and say, can I get involved with one of your studies? And that's fine. I mean, I always love to help students, junior, early career, anybody, because so many people were kind enough to help me in my career. But it shouldn't start with just, I want to get a paper out. It should start off with something, I've observed this, and I'm really interested in it. I don't know. And good research, let me say it right up front, it's not about coming up with answers. good research is really about coming up with the next good question. What other question can I ask that's going to allow me to understand this phenomena that I've observed, or allow me to understand, I have this feeling that, like Cellier said, there's something I've seen. I want to learn more about it. Why is it that I've observed this? How do I explain it? Researchers really are good researchers, I think, are a whole lot less about coming up with answers, but coming up with explanations, because in the human sciences, it's almost never one answer. You want one answer? Go into mathematics or physics. What we do is not about one answer. It's about many pieces of a puzzle. And if we're lucky enough in our career, maybe we'll identify a few of these pieces. And as the generations go on and these pieces start to come together, then we make some hopefully interesting discoveries. And we're all in the health profession, and we allow ourselves the honor of assisting in the overall quality of life. So start your project first and foremost. Is there something you might not even have the specific question? I've had we had a big seminar over the weekend up in Oregon for the Oregon medical students about dealing with stress and coping. And we had a session about starting research careers. And a young woman came up, brilliant young student, and said, I'm interested in research. I said, that's great. What are you interested in? She said, well, my grandparents were Japanese. She was of mixed background, Japanese Caucasian. And she said, my grandparents were a very dark and ugly time in American history during World War II. All Japanese citizens, Japanese American citizens, were essentially put in camps, many of them just in Central California. And it was, again, and we've seen this in others, but, the United States doesn't talk a lot about it, but it was there. And she said, I believe there's something about this distress. And I'm interested now in looking at women who are in medical school, who maybe come from different backgrounds, that identify with multiple groups, and how that affects their resilience. I said, that's a really interesting question. There's a lot of pieces are going to go into that puzzle. And, some of the best questions might not even get answered in your lifetime. But research is about feeling the gratification of working with the team, senior mentors, junior mentors, bringing students on, and simplifying what you're doing to a question that can be studied. There are lots of great topics, but a good research project starts with, I'm interested in my space. I'm interested in sports and mental health. And then I was interested in this observation. And then I got interested in, so what's the deal with depression in athletes? Does it look the same? And after 20 plus years of observing depression in athletes and working with a fellow that somebody might know named Aaron Beck, Tim Beck, a la the Beck Institute and cognitive behavioral therapy. I was his psychopharmacologist for a number of years. He convinced me to take my good notes, and we came up with a depression screener for athletes that's a little bit different than what you see in non-athletes. But again, based on an observation. So the way you start, I believe, is observe something that is of interest to you. I think the next thing to do is find yourself a good research mentor. Don't think you have to do this alone. And actually, what I love about research is how many friends and colleagues. I mean, I never would have gotten to meet Dr. Koh and his colleagues and a wonderful group of people in Malaysia and many research colleagues I have all over the globe. That never would have happened were it not for the fact that as a clinical researcher, you're part of a team. You don't have a successful football team or soccer in your parts of the world by having 11 goalies. You need strikers, midfielders, defensive. You need the goalie. Researchers, it's the same way in the team. You need a part of the team that knows something maybe about biostatistics and how you use biostatistics. You need a member of the team maybe who's a good grant writer. And we're working on some grants now, and we're bringing some in. So research is really a team sport. I've never, ever met anybody. I'm sure they might be out there, but someone who did research. You know, they talked about Albert Einstein used to do what they called mind experiments. So Albert Einstein, actually, he was of the same generation of my grandfather. He was Jewish. He was an American. My grandfather was fairly successful in what he did he was a psychiatrist, actually a sports psychiatrist before there even was such a thing. And he and Freud and Einstein, a lot of the Jews who got in that, you know, got to know each other a little bit. And Einstein did mind experiments. I mean, just adding to his brain. He would literally do the whole thing in his brain. And if you ever read about him, you know, his PhD thesis, which he had trouble getting through, you know, normally hundreds of pages, his was fairly short, E equals MC squared. But then he spent his time, and, you know, now you fast forward 70 plus years, and, you know, he's still considered as brilliant now as he was then. Imagine what he would have been able to do with some of the computer technology that we have now. It's almost staggering. And we could say that about, you know, other brilliant inventors. So get the idea, think about it a little bit. Think, what aspect of this am I interested in its effect on patients and response, or what the impact is on family or culture or religion? I mean, you can do anything, but never forget, you can't do everything. I've seen so many people who their research has gotten derailed because they tried to do too much. And it just doesn't work. I've been the editor-in-chief of a number of journals. I'm an associate editor of a couple of journals now. I can tell you how many papers we reject because there's really not a sense of a focus, or their discussion has very little to do with what they said they did in their methodology. So clarity of thought, getting a team that can help you and that has different strengths, being proud of being part of a research team. The one thing I like about research is you get to pick your research partners. And the further along you go, the more you get to pick. And that I like, because I'm old enough now that I get to pick the people that I think even if we weren't doing research together, they'd just be good social friends. And we have a couple of people on the screen now who I consider close friends, who I've worked with. I've had the great pleasure and honor of being involved with a number of books with Professor Kostyan for many years. And he has become a dear friend. He's my Turkish brother. That's how dear a friend he is. I met Eugene as being a mentor for him years ago, and now we're working on a grant application as we speak. And I've had the chance to mentor him and watch him grow and flourish and become a real star. But more important than that, I consider him my friend, even though he's probably not a whole lot older than my son, but he's my friend. He's my colleague. And we met because of being involved in research and scholarly pursuit. And he'll probably be able to share with you, I ask him the questions. Because again, research is about asking the question. Whether you're a mentor or a mentee, what is the question that I want to ask? And then, how do I ask that question in a way where I can control for many of the other variables that might be impacting my observation? This has been a real problem in the area of concussion. So I'm sure some of you know most of my current work, a lot of it's been in the area of sports concussion. And I've worked with many, many athletes. I do this for the National Football League here in the United States, for the International Olympic Committee. And what we've seen in concussion is it has become very politicized because there are a lot of lawsuits. Most of them were, I think there were a few in the UK, many lawsuits in the US. High school kids, college kids, professional kids. There was actually a movie made by Ridley Scott called Concussion. I don't know if it ever made it across the pond or other parts of the world. It was Will Smith played the lead in it. And it was funny because I actually made a movie that I showed in Istanbul on concussion as well, right before that came out. So Ridley Scott had called me and he said, well, I'd like to take a read of this script. You've done some work in this area. And I read it and I said, well, you know, you got a couple of real issues here. You watch this movie and you would think someone's going to come out thinking, well, the only thing that mattered, that Mike Webster, he was a center that hikes the ball in American football, played for the Pittsburgh Steelers, that the only reason that he ended up with all these serious neurocognitive episodes, what we would now call CTE, was the result of him playing football. And it was really almost like an anti-football, and it was playing into many of the lawsuits that were coming against the National Football League, and then it went into the NCAA, National Collegiate Athletic Association, college sports in the US, and even in high school and youth sports. And I said, you know, you don't mention in the film that he had lived in and out of foster care as a youth. He had been severely abused as a child. He had probably a 25-year history of significant drug abuse, in addition to, yes, having many sports-related concussions. And I said, you know, if you want my opinion, if you're making it, and they made it like it was almost like a documentary, I said, maybe you might want to mention some of that in there. Because those are the facts. And he looked at me and he said, Doc, I'm not interested in making a documentary. I'm interested in making money. And if people think it's a documentary, they go see the film, good enough. I said, well, I'm not your guy to be the consultant for this movie. But this is what good research is about, is you have the idea, you have the observation. Your first thought should be just like, what does a good doctor do? Patient comes in with a complaint. That's kind of your observation, what the patient tells you. What's the first thing you do? You start getting some data in, and you develop a differential diagnosis. What could this be? Could a cough be lung cancer? Could it be allergies? Down the list. And we run tests. And in many ways, research is not that different from good clinical care. Because people say, oh, I can never be a researcher. I said, well, then you tell me you're never going to be a good doctor? And then what are you talking? I said, because a good clinician uses that same mindset. The patient comes in with a complaint. We observe, we auscultate, we get a good history, we do tests, we develop a differential. And then based on that, we create symptom and treatment. So in research, start with the idea. I would highly recommend do something you have an interest in. If you're really interested, it doesn't become work. It's like, geez, I really love reading. I mean, I've been interested in sports. I was a sports guy, put me through college, gave me my first chance to kind of get to see part of the world when I was competing, and the US government was paying the dime, so I didn't have to buy expensive airline tickets. And, you know, they even gave me the clothes I had to wear. So it was really cheap for me. But that observation needs to be that first step. Something you're interested in. If you have no interest at all in something, maybe share the observation with somebody else, let them do it. Unless you think you could develop an interest in it. But my advice would be get something that you find interesting, or you think you could be interested in, or at least you want to know something more about it. Because oftentimes, as you learn more about it, it does become more interesting. Write it down. Once you make the observation, this is when you have to start doing your work. Read about kind of, you're starting to put together what will ultimately be your reference list for a paper, or at least an understanding. And now it is so much easier than it was when I started this as a medical student back in the mid-1970s. You know, we had to go spend hours and hours in the library, everything you had to look up, you go to the stacks, you'd pull it. You know, now you get on Google Scholar, and what it would take me maybe a week to do, I can do in maybe 10 minutes on Google Scholar. And you all know, and you all are way more adept at using technology to do what used to take weeks, minimum weeks, sometimes even more. So you get on Google Scholar, or you get on whatever, PubMed, whatever you like, and start reading what's out there. And what my suspicion is you're likely to find someone else has had an interest in that. It's very tough. I mean, I used to have this little game I would play with the student. I said, pick a topic that you think a question that you think you could ask on Google Scholar and get less than 1,000 hits, not even 100, 1,000 hits. It ain't so easy to do. Even the most esoteric thing, as long as it's reasonable, you usually get, and some of them you get, millions of hits, and it takes all of, 0.8 of a second for them to, to fire them up. So get the idea, research, and see what's been done. And what you might find is this will help you start to refine what your research question is going to be. Get a mentor. Now, your mentor should be someone, A, that you respect. Don't have a mentor you can't stand, because it won't be fun. And you should respect them, that they're a decent person. They care about you. They're not going to just use you, to do all the work, and then they're going to take all the credit. And I hate to say it, but I've worked with colleagues in the past who have used students, kind of like the way we used to use nurses. Nurse, go get the cup of coffee, but don't really engage in patient care. And thank goodness we're well beyond that. That nurses are now highly respected. In fact, more respected than physicians in the U.S. Data would show. So get a good mentor and say, I have this idea, not like, and I'd like to run it by you. And what do you think? And a good mentor should listen and ask you questions. So what do you think might be interesting about this? Do you have any questions that maybe you'd like to address? Any of your observations, like you'd like to say, well, is this just an N of one, a case report? Or is this something, so don't start by saying, well, how am I going to get a grant to do this? Start with the idea, write it down, get your mentor, and then develop a game plan, as we say in the world of sport. Now, the game plan might be, are there people who are already looking at that, either at your institution or somewhere else? I found what I did early on is if I read a paper by somebody that I found really interesting, and maybe I was just too brash and young then, I would literally contact them. And back then we didn't have email. So this is literally how old I am. Free email. But you'd get a phone or I'd write them a letter. And I'd say, I really appreciate, and I remember, Harry Mandel was one. And I said, I've read your stuff. I'm really interested in this. Would it be possible? Could we talk on the phone for 5 minutes? You would be amazed at how honored a true mentor is. We've had the great honor of having Norman Sartorius, who's one of my heroes. I met Norman when he was working with the WHO, and a brilliant researcher, an outstanding educator. He's been a very important and integral part of this series. And he couldn't have been more of a gentleman, as he has always been his entire career. Students were always important to him. He always loved, and to this day, continues to mentor. I think he gave one of his earlier talks he gave to our group, talked about how many of his research colleagues from years gone by, and he makes me feel like, I think maybe that's one of the reasons, he makes me feel like a kid, because compared to him, I'm just, barely in my adolescence of the career, because he has been doing it so well for so long and hasn't missed a beat. I'm just hoping I can be half as productive and as cognitively with it as Professor Sartorius is when I reach his age. But it's just extraordinary. And he will talk to us about how some of his close friends he gets together with holidays are people that he worked with on his research teams. And this is what I've seen when I was at the National Institute of Mental Health. We were basically just a research group there in Bethesda, Maryland. And some of the researchers I worked with there became my good friends. As I said here, some of the people I've met, I have very little doubt. I can't wait to get back to Malaysia, not only to do the research, but to see my friends so we can sit down and talk about where do we go next with this. So get a good mentor. There are very few things that are going to help you more. And if you're with a mentor and it's not working out, it's really not that different than as a psychotherapist, you're seeing a patient and it's just not connecting. It doesn't mean the patient's bad. It doesn't mean you're bad. It means maybe for some reason, countertransference, whatever it might be. And what a good physician, a good therapist would say, well, for some reason we're not, but your mental health and your health are important to me. Maybe, I could make you a referral or something that because ultimately your health and well-being is what's most important to me as your doctor. So in research with mentors, again, a bit of a commonality. Get a mentor who you like, who seems to be interested in you, who you feel you'd like to learn from, who is going to take the time. If a mentor says, I'm just too busy to talk with you, maybe I'm too busy today, but over the next 2 weeks, maybe that's somebody who doesn't really have the time. I think you'll find, I know Dr. Koshin, I've worked with him in his years at Cogelli. The students remember him from years because they knew that he was there for them. He was there to try to educate them, and he was there to learn from them. And I've learned so much. And that's why I thank the people I've had the honor to mentee, because as their mentor, most of them have taught me something. And now it's easy because you teach me anything about technology and I'm smarter than I was beforehand. But even more than that, cultural issues, things that you don't know. So in a research team, that's why everybody's name goes on the paper. Everyone who contributed. First author, it's the person who put the most effort and time into it. When you get old, you get to be senior, the last author, which means you're the one that had a chance to kind of work with all of it. And right now, I get a far greater satisfaction from being a senior mentor. So your research question can be yours. You present it to the mentor, and then you do your homework. You find out what's been done. Now you're in the position to say, okay, what do I really want to study? What piece of this big puzzle that's out there, where do I want to start? Do I want to start with the effect of stress on women in medical education? Or it could be anything. And then what a good researcher does is you start to formulate what your question's going to be. And how are you going to address it? Just like when you formulate your differential diagnosis, what tests am I going to have to run where I can rule out lung cancer or rule out seasonal allergies or rule out environmental issues that are going on? So again, every good clinician, I think a really good clinician, anybody could be a good researcher. A lot of people get intimidated. Oh, I don't know how to write a paper. I'm never smart. I can tell you a lot of people I work with are no more smarter. In fact, many of the clinicians are far smarter. So don't put yourself down if you've not done research, because if you're doing good clinical care and you're learning how to be a good clinician, you're actually learning research technique in a very sophisticated way. You just have to take that step back. So then you start to say, what do I want to study? And then that's when you start bringing with your mentor, but then maybe saying, well, who else might we want to get involved with this? And this is where your mentor can be a tremendous help. The mentor can say, we have a colleague in the endocrine department who could be really helpful in helping us understand the effects of HPA-G axis. Or we have somebody in the GI department who can really help us understand the role of the gut microbiome as a potential etiologic factor in depression. Or maybe somebody in infectious disease who can help us understand the role of the inflammasome in the brain, looking at IL-6, IL-10 ratios. But people who have a level of expertise or knowledge beyond what yours is, don't ever think you have to have all the answers. Remember, it's having the right questions. And what question can I ask that will give me an answer that will help me formulate the next question? Or help me be able to share this, say, we've identified that hypothalamic pituitary axis dysregulation can play a role in how we think, feel, and behave. You never want to overstate kind of when you're working with someone, don't overpromise and underdeliver. Go the other way. So when you write your papers, when you start doing your experiments, say, this could be, based on our results, this could be an important, but you ever notice how every good paper will end but no more research is needed? It's almost the classic type, because it's true. If you think you found the definitive answer to something, either you're exceptionally lucky, you're exceptionally brilliant, although I don't even think smarts has much to do with it, or you're naive and stupid, and you certainly don't want to be any of the latter two. So get with your mentor, write it down. And the one thing, just like what does a good clinician do, is you take good notes. Now with Cerner and Epic, and I'm not a fan of the EMR. It's probably showing my age, but I'm still one. And one of the things I love when I go overseas, particularly in the LMICs that I've had the great honor to work in, is you don't see a whole lot of the EMRs. They're just now coming in. People still take good paper notes as if that's back. I still think in many ways there's some advantages to that. I see where the EMR has some advantages, but I think in our field, I'm waiting to see the next iteration. But in research, you want to keep good notes. You get your research book. You ever notice how research books, they're not the wire binders that you can pull the sheets out with. The research books are the types that the pages are in there, because every observation is an important one. And in fact, if you look at Thomas Edison, who kind of developed electricity in this country, there were many in France and other countries, but they got his notebooks. He said, he probably had at least 100, if not more, negative experiments before he had one that was, quote, positive. And what he said was, I've probably learned more from my negative experiences and studies than my positive. So don't feel like, oh, we did the study and it didn't come out the way I expected it. Research should never be about, well, this is what I want to go out to prove. Because what you see then is you get people like in our field who want to go out and prove that a particular technique, QEEG, I'll use that as an example, that's heavily promoted here in the US, when the data is pretty soft. I'm not saying it's not there at all, but then people they're trying to sell. Then you find out, they have a bit of a conflict of interest. They're making money off that. Certainly there are many good techniques that people will use in a proprietary way. And you're allowed to do that. It's a free country. It's a free world for most of us. But research shouldn't be about trying to sell somebody on something. Look what happened to Selye. He lost the Nobel Prize. So good research is about being proud of not the results, whether it was positive or negative, being proud of being thoughtful, being ethical, looking at all the potential variables that play into it. People talk about, well, I made the observation, and it's an accurate observation, that the majority of people, if you look at the data, die in bed. And I think that's pretty much worldwide, whether it's a hospital bed or in your own bed at home. Well, should the conclusion be that going to bed is deadly, so we should not go to bed? The data is correct. Most people do die in bed. But should we then say that going to bed is a deadly? No, in fact, the reality is we all know sleep is maybe one of the best treatments we have for neurocognitive deficits, through the lymphatic system, that hyperphosphorylation of the tau bodies that kind of slide into the sulci, into the neurons. So observe. You always want to be proud of the fact that you were ethical and you were honest. And if you screw up an experiment, you don't try to cover it up. You say, you know what? I was supposed to be observing this laboratory animal on Friday evening. I forgot all about it. And they went 48 hours. And I've known people who've said, well, they don't really didn't make a difference. No, that's not a good researcher. Just like a good clinician, you don't ever lie to your patient. It's never ethical. Maybe we couch what we say in a way that would be less stressful, but it is never, never ethical to lie to a patient. And if we study Bob Veitch and everyone else in bioethics going back as far as you want to go, that the respect for the patient is one of the core tenets of bioethics. And what I say as a researcher, respect for the research process should have equal weight when you're a researcher to having respect for the patient. So you have your idea. You've written it down. You do your homework. You study it a little bit. You learn a little more. Maybe you learn like, what? I thought it was interesting. Not really so much interesting. Already been studied, I'm not so, or wow, I'm really getting into this. Or, I haven't read anybody that's kind of looked at this particular angle that what I look at. And there are going to be many things that you're going to be able to study that I never could have studied. One of them is, what was the effect of, in this country, started around March 17th, 2020. That's when most of the US started locking down. That's when my university, we locked down. You have to go back to 1913, right, for the Spanish flu before you saw anything even close to this. So you will be able to look at things as psychiatrists, as behavioral health experts. If you go into child psychiatry, I'm not a child psychiatrist. I got a little extra training in it when I finished my residency, because I'm always interested kind of in adolescence. I've done a fair amount of work in adolescence. But I think there's going to be a really important research question to be asked globally is, what will be the effect from the very youngest to up throughout the life cycle in regards to what happened during COVID, from 2020 to really almost 2021, 22, and if you're in China, I was in Beijing for the Olympics. I was in 6 weeks in lockdown in the Olympic Village. And that country was really locked down. And we're now seeing a bit more of that. I got a chance to get out and see a little bit of the town because I was working a number of different venues. So I was in what they called a bubble bus. So I was still in lockdown, but I was in a kind of a protected bus. And it was just amazing to see the city of Beijing, how it had changed since I worked the 2008 games, which summer games in Beijing. So you're going to have opportunities to look at things that were looked at many years ago that you're going to have an opportunity. I'm not saying you should do that, but there are things that have happened in the world. Some of these global, these tragic events. Now, war, unfortunately, has been around for a long time. But I think one of the observations, just to share another vignette, keeping this kind of light, was that during World War II, during the bombings of London, Sir Michael Rudder, who I actually think Norman might have worked with Michael back in the day. But what happened is if you were poor and you were in London during the bombings and the bombing of London, when the Germans bombed London, if you were poor, your kids had to stay with you, had to live through the bombings and kind of what we're probably seeing, unfortunately, now in the Ukraine. If you were rich, you sent your kids out to the countryside because the Germans weren't bombing the countryside. They were bombing the cities. And what Rudder and a number of others did is they looked at these kids years later. And to make a long story short, what they found was very different than what people would have predicted. So it's good that they did the research. They just didn't say, well, it certainly makes sense. The kids who got a chance to go out to the countryside and didn't observe the buildings falling down and people being dead and not being able to eat and all the issues, clearly they did better than the kids who observed the horrors of war. As it turned out, that hypothesis was wrong. The kids who were more resilient and did better from a stress medicine perspective were the kids who were able to stay with their family. They had their support system. Turns out the kids that were sent away, they were under far more stress because they never knew every night, are my mom and dad and family members, are they going to die today? Am I going to wake up tomorrow? That not knowing, as we now know, someone who's had an interest in stress medicine for a long time, if you ever want to play a fun game with your medical students, ask them, well, what's the one universal stressor? And people will say death, or they'll say money, or they'll say relationships, and they're all stressful. But for every scenario, if you're writhing in pain and your loved one has lost all their functioning, sometimes death can be a blessing. And money is probably not as big an issue if you're Elon Musk and you've got, how many, 33 billion or whatever money he's worth. And, relationship. But the one thing that stress medicine doctors will say is being out of control. Whether it's the stress you get before you go in to take a major exam because you don't know, did I study the right stuff? Are they going to ask me silly questions? They talk about people being stressed the night before their wedding. Did I pick the right partner? Maybe they were good friends to hang out with, but do I want to spend the rest of my life? Do I want to raise a family with them? So that sense of being out of control, and what Rudder's work did, and they got cortisol measures, and they, this was again post-Cellier, so we knew something about the biology of stress. So it turns out that hypothesis, which everyone said, well, it's a no-brainer, of course, was wrong. And good data demonstrated that. So I believe you have some incredible opportunities that I will never have, even if, God willing, I live, another 20 or 25 years. I have some decent genes. My mom's turned 90 last year. So I'm hoping I got a lot of her genes and not my dad's, who passed away quite young. So your opportunities to do incredible research, I'm envious of you. I'm envious. I wish I was as smart as most of you probably are. I'm sure you're much smarter than I am. But I'm really envious of your ability to look at this. You'll all be in the sweet spot of your careers. I'm not saying you need to do that. But the role of technology, I'm just fascinated on ChatGPT. What's that going to do for our specialty? Didn't exist. If you use the word ChatGPT in my day, people say, oh, we want to have a chat. We'll sit and talk. We'll have a chat. The role of social media, the role of technology, the role of machine learning, of AI. These are just alphabet soup to me. You all grew up with this. You knew it. You can understand cyberbullying in a way that I never could. I choose not to participate in a lot of this social media stuff. I don't have enough, I can barely keep up with emails, but I've seen the downside of that in adolescents I've worked with. So I'm not saying social media shouldn't exist, but I think we all know that there is a downside to social media. You all have lived it. You've grown up with it. I didn't. The way I communicated with my friends is we either sat down and talked, or we got on a telephone that was attached to the wall that had a cord about yay long. I mean, I remember that, you know, people talking about someday there's going to be phones that you can carry, literally. And Los Angeles was one of the first cities in the US that had them. And the phones were like this big. It was like a giant brick. And it was a real status symbol. So people would buy them that were basically fake, just so they look cool. So they'd be driving around with what's thought to be a cell phone. And now we fast forward, and you know, my son got me one of these iWatches, which is connected. When I was over there, Eugene taught me more about technology in the few weeks I was with him, because he's a tech expert. But your generation will have lived this, will have seen what it means. What does it mean for when social media goes wrong? When someone posts something when they were in high school that now they kind of regret, but yet, you know, you might as well have tattooed it on your forehead, because it ain't so easy to not, you know, to get it from cyberspace. So the opportunities to do really important, meaningful research are nothing short of extraordinary. And your knowledge and skills and life experience are something that your mentors will never have. So I rely on Eugene when we were over there for his observations. He's got young children. If I had grandchildren, they'd probably be about the age of his kids. I've not yet been blessed with grandchildren. Editorial comment. But the observations that you can make, do what, it's interesting. Sherlock Holmes, yeah, and hopefully some of you, Sherlock Holmes, you know, the detective books, and there were many, many movies. They were my favorite. Turns out Sherlock Holmes was very popular amongst medical students. They were actually clubs. It was called Sons of the Copper Breeches, which was one of his books. And the reason medical students loved Sherlock Holmes was it was like the ultimate. It's like he would get facts like symptoms, and then he would follow them through. And if you think about it, it was a lot of the research. He was kind of doing in his own way the research. He'd make observations, and he was a brilliant observer. He would observe things that other people didn't. And in research, sometimes the best researchers are the ones say, you know, there's something about this. I can't quite understand it, but I think it might play a role. So get your ideas, write them down. Don't think that an idea is a stupid one. And the fact that somebody else did it doesn't mean that you mightn't have something to offer. Because again, if you're interested in depression, yeah, there's been probably a few million papers written about depression in different ways. But how many papers have maybe looked at what the impact of depression is on someone who experienced cyberbullying, or is having lived the early years of life, maybe not, you know, maybe that 4 to 6, kind of that latency period in the years from late 2019 to 2022. Did that play a role in that? Did that isolation, just, you know, the Surgeon General of the United States came out last week, Surgeon General Murthy, and said that one of the single biggest public health, not mental health, but public health issues is loneliness. Loneliness now is a big issue with a lot of NIH grants. And literally the Surgeon General came out on National Public Radio in the United States and said that loneliness is a significant health risk. Well, a lot of people during COVID felt lonely, even if you could get on Zoom. I mean, this conversation, I would love to be able to wiggle my nose and suddenly we'd all be sitting in a room with a nice cup of tea, maybe some nice Turkish tea and some crimp, and we could sit and exchange ideas. Some of the best times I had when I was in Malaysia was Eugene was such a wonderful host. We'd go out and have these wonderful meals at places I never would have been able to find, and we'd sit and have a lovely meal and talk about the stuff we were going to do. So keep the passion. Don't let your mentor, if a mentor starts talking out of something, that's not a good mentor. It's like if you had a professor of medicine and said, no, you don't really want to take care of patients. Maybe that's not who you want for a clinical supervisor. But if you're lucky enough to get a supervisor like Professor Kostyan, and all he's going to do is encourage you He's going to make you feel good about what you're doing. He's going to spur you on, because that's what a really good mentor does. A really good mentor inspires you. Flames of passion get much bigger with a good mentor. And the reason they do that is because you, as their mentee, are allowing them to fulfill their passion and how great it feels. For those of you who have kids, I know at least some of you have one here. I'm sure the most valued artwork you have in your entire home is that artwork that your child did when they were 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or whatever, and you put up on a magnet on your refrigerator. And if that's not your most important piece of artwork, then shame on you as a parent. But you go into very few people's houses and, oh yeah, here's my Van Gogh, but look what my 4-year-old did. And that's because we're social animals and we'd like that level of support. So bring in the team. Don't try to do research when it's going to be real hard to do. I've had so many first and second year medical students who say, I want to get involved with research. I said, well, in the US, you got your first summer off between first and second year. Now, medical education is a bit different in the US. So we go to 4 years of college, and then you go to 4 years of medical school, and then you do your residency. And the only time you have off once you start medical school is that first summer between your first and second year. After that, you go straight through until you graduate, and then you start your residency, and then you wait till 50 years after that, and then you take your first vacation. I'm just telling you, don't do that. That's the worst thing to do. Make sure you take time for yourself. And I say, if you want to do some research, first, make sure you take some time to relax and enjoy yourself during that time off. And if you want to come, maybe we can talk about something, but don't feel as a first or second year, even a third year. Now, in the US, the 4th year medical school, you end up getting a lot more elective time. You get your kind of required stuff done by the 3rd year. So then you can start it. But and I say this as someone who I was fortunate enough to be able to start, doing research and writing papers even before I got to medical school, but certainly during it. But I would recommend that the thing you should be focusing on now as a medical student is becoming a good, well-trained doctor. Whether you become a clinician, a researcher, an educator, that should be your top priority. If you're interested in research, go to the research congresses, go to listen to how people present their data, learn from the good and the bad. Some of the most important lessons I've learned were things that I say, I'm never going to do that. So it's not only the good you learn from, but sometimes we learn from the bad. And I'll put bad in quotes. It won't go away. In fact, what I found is as you get into the clinics and you start doing if you become a clinical researcher, that you become a bit more sophisticated. So it's not like, well, I can't even think about it, but let it kind of simmer and grow. Get your ideas, talk to people, but don't let it get in the way of a successful medical education. Because at the end, that's going to be important. That will make you a better researcher. It will clearly make you a clinician and also help you pass your boards. So don't lose the passion, but get involved. Start talking to some. I remember talking to a guy who was doing work with the Philadelphia Eagles, which is the pro football team in the city I grew up in when I was still in college. And I spent some time and went with him and started getting involved with sports medicine. But I knew I was always kind of interested in kind of sports mental health. What did it mean when an athlete got depressed or anxious, or they started worrying about, am I ever going to get back? Or doping was just a big thing. Remember, doping really goes back in the Olympics. In the 50s, it really didn't come up till 68, 72, those games. But, we knew it in 54. We knew about the role of steroids. And now that's become a big issue, athletes and TUEs. So you can get involved, but don't feel like you've got to I'm not going to study physiology tonight because I need to read this research paper. I've gotten some mentors I got very early on that I wasn't directly involved, but they say, yeah, come on to the research call. If you got time, just sit in and observe. So becoming a good researcher is very similar to becoming a good clinician. And just because you did research, a lot of students in the US do research, not so that they're so much interested in it, but they say, well, it helps to get into medical school. If I get my name on a paper or a poster, I did something, nothing the matter with that. But if you really loved it, then you say, yeah, this is something I might want to do. If you did it just to get into med school, okay, no dishonor in that. but don't commit a career to something that you really say, yeah, really, what I really love is I like seeing patients. I like helping people. Then be proud about being the best clinician you can be, or maybe a clinician educator. So one of the things I wanted to do is to just, it's something, it's a process. It's a thought process that goes through. It's a team approach. Every team has a good coach. Think of your mentor as your coach. I'm sure many of you are athletes. Just remember what a good coach can do, not for you individually. They can certainly help, but as the research team. So your mentor is your coach. To be a winning team is to be ethical, to think it through. Don't start doing biostats when you've collected all the data. You need to bring in that biostatistician when you're first formulating your idea so that you're collecting the data in a way that's analyzable. If you're going to do research, you usually do that because you want to share that with the rest of the world. So that means writing thoughtful papers. Maybe you're not the greatest writer. Not all of us are great writers. Some are better than others. So you need to maybe have a member of your team who maybe is a better writer. Your contribution might be seeing the patients, maybe looking things up. Again, a soccer team, we don't necessarily expect the goalkeeper to be going up and, doing the corner kicks or, doing the head balls into the goal. You want them to stop the ball. So we need to understand and be respectful and work together and learn. And just like a sports team, always be proud of the work you do. Even if what you find out is our hypothesis was wrong. But I'm proud that we did good research, whether it's randomized controlled trials, double blinding. We thought about everything that could explain why it was right or why it was wrong. Because the big issues, from research, from biostats you probably took when you were in college or high school, is type 1 and type 2 error. You don't want to say something is true and it's not, type 1 error. But it's equally as bad to say something isn't true and it is, type 2 error. Like Selye said, smoking lowers stress, so smoking must be good for health. No. And it's probably a good thing that he's remembered as a brilliant, significant contributions that he made, literally the father or grandfather of stress medicine. But I think selling out to the drug and what that meant, probably to me, when I think about it, maybe it's not a bad thing that he never did win the Nobel Prize. He's certainly respected for the brilliance that he was. And that, to me, is my story, and I'm sticking to it. So let's end with some questions and some comments. It's so late, I can't even read the time on I can tell you now that, because I have Kuala Lumpur time on my watch, because I'm always late for meetings there. So I can tell you in KL, it looks like it's 4:06. Is that correct, Gene? So as long as it's 4:06, I shouldn't be tired, because that means if I subtract 15 from that, means it must be about 1:06 a.m. here in the US. So thank you all for this, but maybe have some questions or comments, certainly we have such wonderful folks, our two co-leaders of our seed group, our senior members of our section, and Professor Boulan and Professor Ko, maybe some final thoughts or questions or comments. And then I really would be honored and pleased to be reading your papers somewhere in the not too distant future. Thank you all. Please, my colleagues and friends. Boulan, my brother, share some of your wisdom with us.
After you, it's very hard to say any other thing. It was really impressive and, as usual, very useful messages given out by you. Thank you very much for that.
Dr. Ko, Eugene. Now he's one of the people that I'm so thankful for, that allow me to mentor him for quite a number of years now. But what can you share with the group? And you can say he was a terrible mentor. That's okay. I won't hold it against you. You've created your own career.
No, I truly agree with a lot of the points being said, both as your mentee, as someone who actually was mentored in this, and also as someone who has been doing research for not as long, but long enough to be able, because I recently had this similar conversation with one of my own students, and I was trying to convince my student to go into academics, And her idea was that my work involved me sitting in the lab, collecting data and doing analysis day in, day out. And what I did was I actually took out my CV and I showed it to her. And I pointed out to her, look at all the research I've done over the years. Count how many of them I actually sat down and started collecting data in your traditional intervention RCTs. I think we only had 2, barely. And that's what a lot of people don't get, is that when we say research, people always tend to think it's always about data collection and other things. It's way beyond that. And most of the time it goes back to that very idea. It's all about finding a question that we want an answer to.
Yep.
If you're passionate enough, you do long enough, it comes out. And I could relate to a lot of the points that Dave mentioned just now, because this is exactly what I do. And I think this is exactly what I can go as far to say that Rodrigo does the same thing, because I read a lot of his works. I am also, and a lot of us will do the same thing. It's just something we jump into with a sense of curiosity, and then we can work from there and see what comes up.
I think that's so great, because it is curiosity. And there are many different flavors of research. Again, I think a lot of people, we all kind of know what it's like to be a clinician, because that's, we see that. But research, and good research, it's interdisciplinary, it's collaborative. So I've worked with basic researchers. I've worked in animal labs. Don't really like it because you can't develop a relationship with the mouse, particularly when you end up cutting off its head and putting its brain in a blender. And then, it's not the same kind of social relationship. But research comes in many different forms. And I really believe, as we are trained as physicians, I have a bias towards doing clinical research, because we have those people's skills. We understand it. So not that you can't do that. In fact, MD PhDs in the US usually end up either doing the work more of like a PhD or more of a clinical. Rarely do you see what we'd like to see, which is that translational work, which Eugene and Boulant know has been a very strong interest of mine, kind of what we call molecules to mainstream. What do we learn at the molecular level? And then what does it mean for public policy? And then everything in between. So a curiosity, a passion, and don't think that you can't do it. If you're smart enough to get into medical school, there is no doubt, if that's what you choose to do, you could be a successful researcher. You don't have to, and you'll be respected for being a good clinician. I think that's a wonderful, but don't think I'm not smart enough or I don't have the skills, because you actually do. And if you have the passion and the curiosity, I can tell you, I've been fortunate to do some clinical work as a clinical educator, and has been in universities. I've taken it. The thing that has brought me the greatest joy has been meeting all my friends and colleagues and co-workers and co-researchers and educators around the globe and students around the globe that I wouldn't have been able to do if I were just a clinician. And I don't mean just as if it's less of, but if I could be proud of seeing however many patients. But it's a wonderful career. And it doesn't have to be all of it. I mean, I know many people who have a busy practice, but still want to engage, and maybe they'll see patients as part of another research. So there's, again, many different players on the research team, but have the passion, have the curiosity. And I couldn't end the talk by not telling you something that if you get a good mentor and you have that passion, it's going to be something you're going to say, I was truly blessed to be able to have this opportunity to work in this field. Just like you should feel blessed to be able to help people in their running of a happy, healthy, and productive life. So let me end there. Thank all of you. Wish you all the best in your career. And at least a couple of you start thinking about what this role of COVID and what it meant, and particularly in our field. Because I think it's going to be just so important as we start to understand more about the biology of mental illness. But really, as we all know, it's really biopsychosocial, spiritual, and how they interact together. So thank you all. No questions, nothing in the chat. And Eugene told me I was going to look in the chat. So, sorry for, okay.
Words. So yeah, when I just got into medical school, I remember they made us watch a TED talk about how to be a good doctor. And they also showed us this similarity to being like, being a good observer. So they gave us the example of Sherlock Holmes as well. So later on, I remember when I was a second year medical school, I did a summer internship in rheumatology just because I was interested. And I noticed a yellow spot around the eyes of patients, and it was like common. And I asked, but I didn't know it was xanthelasma. I learned it later, but it was just it wasn't that common with random people in the street. Yeah, I just realized how it was common with these rheumatology patients, and I tried to ask about it, but I didn't know the name. I didn't even know it was a finding. So later on, maybe I could get a feedback, but I was discouraged in my life. I mean, in my medical life in general, because our professors were later in their career and they were really busy with their work. And I remember, yeah, I was a little disconnected with my childhood dreams during my medical school life. There was not really something building those things. And now I really tried to be a good observer. That was what I did. And maybe later I also had some good observations, but you know, everybody around me, they were interested in making a research. As you said, it was just to get a paper, just to add something new to their CV and all these things. And I was like, yeah, I'm good. Maybe I'm doing these observations, but I don't know. I mean, I don't feel like really enthusiastic to write a paper. I mean, it is because everybody is just talking about just to do it, not because they have an observation or they are, you know, this. And I'm really thankful that you linked my childhood dreams right now to, well, you know.
So that comment made it worth staying up to 1:15 in the morning here. And I will tell you, any mentor, I don't care how old they are, if they say they don't have time for their students, then they should be like old enough to retire, because there's no greater joy in our field than having the honor to deal with the next generation of leaders and brilliant young minds. And you're young because compared to me, you're all young, except for Bulan. We're brothers. You all could be the children, you know, as far as age. But thank you for sharing that. And it pains me because I think a lot of medical students have more interest, but they get turned off to it. Just like in some medical schools, we kind of beat the humanality out of, you know, like we beat medical students up with how much they have to learn. And some of that humanism goes out with it. So I would say any mentor, I don't care how old they are, that doesn't have time for that, I wouldn't want them to be my mentor, because there's no, you know, other than maybe taking care of patients when you're a clinician, there's no greater joy than working with the young generation and learning and working together. It's the thing that I think keeps you young. So thank you for that. Any other final comments for the folks we have on here? I appreciate you taking part of your mid-morning, afternoon to share with us. And we look forward to hearing from and working together. Hopefully the seed group, you know, we want to keep this going. And yes, it's difficult with 15-hour time difference between LA and Kuala Lumpur, or 10 hours or 9 hours in, you know, other parts of the world. But I think it's important. I think things like seed really need to continue, where we can interact with each other. I only wish we could get together in person, but talk about these ideas that are not just research, but ideas that are important to us, and that we can connect as global medical students. The world is a much smaller place than it was when I went through it because of social media. And, you know, they would have thought I was psychotic if I say, well, I'm going to give a lecture, we're going to have students and faculty from all over the world, and we're going to, you know, we'd look at each other's faces. You know, they would have started me on Haldol back in the day. You know, that was the antipsychotic du jour. So the world changes, but I hope you all stay engaged and tell us what we can do and help Dr. Koshin and Dr. Ko to continue to have this grow. We want this to be student run and student mediated. I apologize for it being kind of a boring lecture, but I couldn't think of how to engage in a way because I wasn't sure how many would be on. I did decide not to show, because I do have a lot of slides on this. I decided to do more of a storytelling, like an old grandpa telling a story, a bedtime story or a daytime story here, rather than showing you a bunch of statistics on how many go into research and how do you develop a research protocol. That's what your mentor should teach you. I don't want to steal that luxury from them. So, Eugene, we started the day and ended it with you. Have a good day. My brother Bulan, always a pleasure. thank the two of you for all the work you've done in keeping this going. You all owe them a debt of thanks, the energy they put in to keep this going. And they do it not for them, but they do it for you.
We have
Rodrigo, Ramin,
and all the other young friends. So I wish it will continue like this. Thank you. If you don't have anything else, I'm going to close the broadcast.
Have a great day, everybody. I'm off to bed.
Thank you.